This is Top of the Morning. I'm Steve Izan. We are in beautiful downtown Baltimore. We are on the USS Constellation. It's in the Inner Harbor. If you haven't been to the Inner Harbor in a while, you should come on down. There's a lot of entertainment. There's a lot of things to do. I'm here today with, would crewman be the right word? Or
yes, sir.
Crewman Forrest Gwinn.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Welcome aboard the Constellation.
Well, we're delighted to be here. First, before we talk a little bit about the Constellation, as they say, let's talk about you.
Okay. I was born in Baltimore, son of a U.S. Navy sailor, basic Navy brat. And for the first 10 years of my life, I spent living on or around or near U.S. Navy bases. When my dad got out of the naval service in 1985, he moved us back to Baltimore. We stayed here for a year. We got a job with NASA, and we lived in Laurel, PG County. You know, moved around Howard County, Georgia for a little bit. Went to school at University of Maryland, College Park. Studied economics and joined the Marine Corps. A little different than the Navy, but still in the Department of Navy, so still within the family.
That counts. And I was also going to kid you a little bit about, for someone born in Bulmer, you don't have that Bulmer accent, but
again,
can you do a Bulmer accent?
No, I could approximate just about any other accents except for the Baltimore accent.
All right, well, that is a unique accent. A little bit about the ship. For some of our viewers that have seen the program before, you've seen us on the Constellation from time to time, but for you new viewers, what are some of the basic facts that our viewers should know?
The first fact that people should know about the USS Constellation is that she is not the sister ship of the USS Constitution, harbored in Boston, Massachusetts.
Okay.
The original frigate Constellation and Constitution had 2 gun decks. Our Constellation has only 1 gun deck, which qualifies her as a sloop of war.
Sloop of war, all right.
The original Constellation was, she was taken and she was basically scuttled, decommissioned, and parts of her were used to build this current Constellation that we are on. This Constellation is the last all-sail, tall, wooden warship designed by the United States Navy. She was commissioned in 1854. Yesterday was her commissioning date, her 158th anniversary.
158th, all right.
And she had quite a bit of history. Her primary purpose mainly was to intercept and interdict and interfere with the still ongoing slave trade up until the U.S. Civil War.
Well, let's talk some dates for just a moment. When you say that she was the last of her kind that was designed by the Navy, roughly what year was that? 1850s or something?
Yes, we're talking about the mid-1850s.
Okay. I suppose another question our viewers would have is, did she fight in the Civil War or have any role?
She was involved in the Civil War. She did not fight because, for the most part, she was obsolete by the time the U.S. Civil War came around.
Interesting. So built in the 1850s and obsolete by the early 1860s.
Yes.
Because of the advent of iron, of steel,
yes.
Steel ships.
Yes, exactly. But she still performed a lot of blockading missions.
Okay.
She blockaded a lot of the southern ports from South Carolina on, and we even saw action as a blockader in the Gulf. Now, she did try to chase down some of the more advanced ships that was used by the Confederacy, but they were able to outrun her because of the fact that they were able to burn coal and boil water for their fuel and head into the wind. And, well, they're able to sail just out of range of her guns.
Okay, did she ever have any foreign adventures, or was she always in the U.S. coastal waters?
Actually, her first few missions was in the Mediterranean. This ship that we're on was basically a flagship for all her career, for the most part, when she did sea service. So she led a Mediterranean squadron out into the Mediterranean seas, and basically to represent the United States foreign interests leading up into the Civil War, and to intercept southern ships that were trying to gain political favors with Britain and France.
Okay, so that must have been like in the late 1850s then,
yes.
before the war broke out between the states.
And as I mentioned earlier, her primary duty was as a interferer of the slave trade. So after that, she was immediately assigned to lead a squadron on the coast of West Africa to stop the slave trade. Now, over the course of roughly about 3 years, she and her West African squadron was able to intercept and capture about 14 slave ships during that time.
Interesting, interesting. Clearly an imposing ship for her time, even if she was technically becoming obsolete. Do you know if her guns ever sank any other ships? I mean, you talk about interdiction, but did she actually ever get into any battles or fire her guns in anger, as they say?
There was one time in which she actually did fire her guns, and it was during her tour as the leader of the West African squadron. She had caught the slave ship Cora, which is the slave ship Cora is classified as a Baltimore skipper.
Okay. Before we go any further, our viewers may hear some noise in the background. Just want to let them know this is a working ship and we're in a working environment. Sounds like a skip loader or something in the background. So sorry for the interruption, but continue on.
Okay, no problem. Thank you, sir. She did interfere with the Cora's mission of bringing more slaves into South America, the West Indies, the Caribbean, and North America. She captured the Cora. That was the biggest prize that she caught. She did fire her guns as a warning. She didn't hit it. She wasn't trying to hit it because the Cora had upwards of maybe 700 African slaves.
Okay.
But she did fire them to basically tell the Cora, okay, we caught you, we can catch you. If we have to, we'll hit you, maybe cause some damage. So if you, your crew, and your prize cargo want to survive, stop now, which is what the Cora did.
Yeah, a wise decision. Well, Forrest, we've got more questions for you, but we've got to take a short break. We'll be right back. Please stay with us.
Constellation's early career is perhaps her proudest and most exciting. From 1855 to 1858, she sailed the Mediterranean to protect American interest and show the flag. From 1859 to 1861, she served as flagship of the U.S. African Squadron, cruising off the western coast of Africa in pursuit of American slave ships.
The most important thing that people learn on this ship that very few had ever heard of was the ship's relationship to the African Squadron. That this country did have at sea, before the Civil War, a fleet of ships designed solely to free slaves who'd been captured and were on their way to the Western Hemisphere.
Constellation captured 3 slave ships, Delicia, Cora, and Triton. Cora alone carried a human cargo of 705 captive Africans. While Constellation was flagship, the U.S. African Squadron captured 14 slave ships and freed almost 4,000 Africans destined for slavery in the Americas.
Welcome back. Now that was an interesting clip. I mean, there's so much about the slave trade that is the general public today just doesn't realize. It was probably perhaps much more of a hot topic, if you will, as it was coming to an end and so on and through the turn of the century. But people today probably, you know, when they see that clip, just don't realize the perversity of it,
Yes. Yes. It was a very divisive issue. As mentioned before, this was all leading into the Civil War. And even though the crew of the Constellation performed their duties as professionals, national, or rather local and state pride and loyalties was a hot topic issue amongst the crew. And so essentially what happened after they captured the Cora, that was the first time that actually led to the trial of a slave trading captain.
Oh, interesting.
Yes.
And then was he convicted?
He was tried, but he was not convicted. He had enough clout and enough influence that he was able to be let go. I think his name was Captain John Latham. Okay. And his crew, of course, you know, the men under him, you know, served time, but he was able to go away, but nothing ever was heard from him again. But it was significant in that there was even though it was only happened once, that a slave trading captain was caught, convicted, and tried in an American court.
Justice being what it is, he didn't get punished.
That's correct. I would have liked for him to be punished, historically speaking, but the truth of the matter is that what it did do was that it basically sent out a big ripple wave. It said that the Union wasn't going to stand for it, and that the efforts wasn't just a mere show, and that they were serious, but also at the same time, it points out that even back then there were corrupt elements, and within our justice system. But even ultimately, justice was served in that even though there was a violent war that occurred, it did end. Basically, it ended slavery. Now, the period after that, there was still cruelty and a lot of racism and things that spurred on a lot of bad race relations that we're still recovering from today. But it set in motion, I think, one of the things that helped set in motion, from my point of view, the social progress that we're still sort of inching towards, despite the fact that we still have lingering elements from those dark days.
And we certainly do. I just want to remind our viewers again, we still have a lot of background noise. It's a lot of things happening in the harbor.
Right.
In terms of this particular ship, was this one of the last ships to try and import slaves? Because at a certain point it did come to a total halt.
The Cora, not this particular ship, because we always get that kind of question when visitors come in, because we have a display that actually would show how slave ships would board Africans. They would literally pack the Africans from in sardine style. But one of the things that is not always mentioned in slavery when we discuss slavery was that slavery is a human condition. It's not a European thing. You can look in any nation, anywhere on the globe, and see some kind of slavery. But the plantation slavery that was used in this country and in South America was an institution that was already well practiced in West Africa by the West Africans, because it was more or less a tribal national institution there, and it was ritualized. When African tribes go to war, they would capture their enemies, and because they weren't members of the tribe, they would basically make slaves out of them. And so when the Europeans in the late 15th and 16th century started trading and setting up posts, they were not used to the hot tropical humid conditions and the viruses carried by the insects and everything else. So they really needed the African tribes to help them with their trading. But the African tribes also would see an opportunity, and so they already were at war with each other, so they would go to war with each other, and part of the things that was traded was guns and spices and things brought from Europe, and the Africans would trade, again, their spices, homemade goods, as well as slaves to the Europeans.
It's amazing to think that that's how that started.
And exactly. And one of the ways a lot of African Americans was brought to this country was because some of the more stronger African tribes that actually benefited from that actually helped to stabilize whatever growing culture that was already there, using the weapons that they got through trading with the Europeans to wage war on each other, which incidentally is one of the reasons why when you hear about genocide in West Africa right now, that's pretty much how it got started. I mean, that's a whole new topic too when you get into like 19th century European colonialism, but as far as Americans was concerned, that's how the idea of slavery was brought, because when Europeans had slaves, it was pretty much a serfdom.
We're going to have to take a short break. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We are clearly having an important topic. It was important a century ago. It's still important today because we continue to evolve. But I'm amazed to hear, and probably some of our viewers will be, that in effect some of the slave trade that came to America really in effect was one African tribe enslaving another and then trading them for guns and things that they wanted. I just find that amazing.
Yes, because there's been a lot of research, and again, around that time in the 19th century, a lot of European and American slave traders, when they would still go engage in illegal slave trade, which was legally banned by the U.S. and Britain around 1806, that didn't stop slave traders from going to Africa. And in fact, the United States and Britain actually legally condemned that slave trade as piracy. That was considered piracy in the mid-19th century, to actually continue the slave trade. And slave traders, if they wanted to buy slaves, they would go to specifically designated ports along the African, West African coast called barracoons, known as slave factories. And that's where African tribesmen would bring in on a regular basis other African tribes that they have caught and basically shackle and keep in very harsh, severe conditions. And then you would have European and Americans who were there, basically giving physicals or pseudo-medical exams so that they could, then sell to whatever slave trader that sailed from either North or South America to buy the slaves to sell to South America, and again, the Caribbean, the West Indies, and into the United States secretly. But yes, these facilities was maintained by African tribesmen who had basically learned to profit off of it.
You mentioned that Britain and the U.S. specifically passed laws outlawing slavery, but that leaves a lot of other countries that didn't. Did African slave traders then try and sell slaves to other countries?
Yes, because one of the first ports that a lot of slave trading ships would hit on their way to the Americas was Cuba. A lot of the islands in the West Indies, and then from there they would fan out to Baltimore, Annapolis, Richmond, Charleston, South Carolina, Charlotte, North Carolina, Atlanta, Georgia, Rio de Janeiro, parts of Mexico, all over.
So Forrest, the U.S. and Britain ban trading, but it really doesn't stop it. They fan out to points of less resistance, perhaps.
Yes, and one of the things that was so ironic, and so I think if you actually look deeper into it, is that a lot of the money was funneled out of New York. And that's important because when you look at, the political geographic climate of the Civil War and the Civil War emotions, you would always think that everything above the Mason-Dixon line, which is basically Pennsylvania up to Maine, right, was pro-abolition, it was pro-union, but a lot of the banking, a lot of the money came out of New York. And New York was, the state of New York, was one of the primary supporters of, of Lincoln and the American Civil War. But then you find out that Captain John Latham was getting money from Portuguese bankers and bankers from inside the United States out of New York City to continue to fund his slave expedition. It kind of shocks you and makes you scratch your head, and so you can't help but rethink, the role of, a lot of these states, and that, it really was divisive, and that even though a lot of these states did support the Union, there were still elements within that state that were still, trying to benefit from the money that was coming in from the sale of slaves.
Let's go back to the Civil War for a moment.
All right.
The Civil War ends.
Right.
President Nixon, with the Emancipation Proclamation, frees the slaves, but all of a sudden 10 million individuals who had been slaves are now told that they're free. And the U.S. enters that area, the era that's known as Reconstruction. Now, you were sharing with me during the break that your family has some connection to that.
Yes. Basically, what happened was that the Reconstruction era is how we got a lot of our black schools, like Howard, Morgan, Coppin State, Florida AMU. And there was a time in which there was a bank called the Freedmen's Bureau that, actually allowed African Americans to bank and to deposit money and funds and all of that. My family, my father's mother, they grew up on a slave plantation in Crenshaw or Kershaw County, South Carolina. And from the family history, I don't know our great matriarch's name, but she had 3 sons. The oldest, January, the middle was Alice, and the youngest was Noah. And basically, January Johnson was right around the time of the Civil War. He had committed the horrific crime that any African American could have committed then, and to a certain extent can still commit now, depending on the situation, which was kill a white man. And he literally was run out of the county, but contrary to what you might have believed about American history during that time, the whites really didn't prosecute him, because there was a lot of legislation that said that there were no freed blacks, and the blacks, with the Dred Scott case, and Robert C. Taney, who incidentally is the name of the ship, our Coast Guard ship.
Right, the Coast Guard ship.
Yeah, it was named after that very same judge who ruled that Dred Scott, even though he fled his master from the South, Indiana, was not considered free, which was one of the pivotal matches that ignited what became the Civil War. But his decision basically said that if I was your slave and I ran away, you could go anywhere you wanted to capture me. But the whites in that county didn't go after January. So here comes the American Civil War. The 2 brothers ended up fighting on opposite sides. Now, the line that I'm from, Alice, the second son.
Look, I hate to interject, but let me go back for just a second.
Okay.
2 black relatives. One fought for the North, the other fought for the South?
Yes. And the one that I'm descended from, Alice, eventually was enrolled or conscripted to fight for the South, because at that time, given the war of attrition and the advent of the Industrial Revolution, the North basically attrited the South down, and the South couldn't beef up their numbers. So Confederate President Jefferson Davis had no choice but to actually free the slaves and then conscript them. And so my great patriarch, who basically started our family line, fought for the South. His younger brother fought for the North. They didn't fight against each other, thankfully. But at the end of the war, they were all receiving checks, I guess, part of the whole Freedmen's Bureau. But there were still whites in the area that were angry, and a few Johnsons who, for whatever reason, stole the family's income. So the family got together, and this is our family history. We got together, we petitioned Congress, and a congressman basically changed our family name from Johnson to Mingo, M-I-N-G-O, which we later found out was a Native American name, which again was ironic because the line that I'm from, Ellis, he was half Indian, half African American, where his other 2 brothers were black. And so, we're descended from that line. And to this day, we still get together, and there's not many African Americans that have the name Mingo. It's not a common name. So if I ever run into or hear about an African American whose last name is Mingo, we automatically know, okay, somehow, some way we're related. We don't know how, but there's a connection. And so our family sort of spread from South Carolina up north and a little bit out west, but for the most part, we tend to still get together around these parts and have, family reunions and everything else.
It's a fascinating history. Forrest, one of the things that you mentioned was that your great earlier relatives petitioned Congress.
Yes.
Now, it wasn't only for a name change, though, wasn't it, to try and get some funds that they'd been robbed of? Were they successful there?
it was for the purpose of just overall social and personal justice. I do believe that they did get their money that they were entitled to under those conditions. I would have to check with other relatives who know better than I do. But I believe that is pretty much the start of how my family, or my late grandmother's family, got started. But yes, it was justice. Justice did prevail in that situation because, well, I'm here as a result of it. So it's more than just them getting their funds. It was just, I guess, a new start, basically. My grandmother, you know, having been born in 1924, my grandmother and grandfather, during the Great Depression, it was like, I mean, they both passed within 2 years of each other, you know, the last couple of years, but, you know, the result of that was that they were born in the Great Depression. They saw the end of the Great Depression. They saw the end of Jim Crow, which was one of the harsher legacies to come out of the Civil War and the failed Reconstruction and all of that. And they saw that end, and we're starting to see the benefits of what, you know, we can achieve when those things like Jim Crow and, you know, slavery, you know, if we want to, even as both individuals and as a group of people, can push beyond that, what can happen, regardless if it's, you know, only small doses or on a larger scale. And my grandmother saw that. She had 3 sons. Well, she and my grandfather saw, you know, World War II, and the social benefits that come from World War II, when, you know, the whole nation had to be mobilized. My grandmother had worked in the Essex munitions plant out there, helping them in the contributing to the war efforts, and she was literally one of the Rosie the Riveters, you know, so that men could go out and fight. After World War II, you know, they, you know, saw the end of the Cold War. They saw the civil rights movement. They had 3 sons, none of whom had to fight in Vietnam, even though they did serve in the military around that time. Well, she had 5 grandkids, college educated.
Forrest, it's a great story. We're just about out of time, though. Any last words for our viewers? It's been a great program.
Thank you. Well, basically, thank you for having me on. I didn't expect to go into so much detail, but yeah, I just love this ship. I mean, like I said, I think a lot of it had to do with maybe an unconscious thing of seeing my dad when I was a little boy, you know, dress up in his naval uniform, and, you know, always seeing him on docks and wharves, you know, when he was in service as a little boy, and then living, you know, on naval bases, and always, you know, saying, okay, one day I'm gonna be like him. And, you know, my contribution as a Marine, even though it's only 3.5 short years, but just following in the military footsteps.
And you're continuing in that tradition. Well, this is Top of the Morning. We've had a wonderful time, a very inspirational time with Forrest Gwinn this morning. Forrest, thank you very much for coming on the show.
You're welcome.
I'm Steve Isant. Thanks for viewing. We'll see you next time. And so there you go. Well, that was great.